I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell the president, should he be Catholic, how to act, and no Protestant minister would tell his parishioners for whom to vote, where no church or church school is granted any public funds or political preference, and where no man is denied public office merely because his religion differs from the president who might appoint him or the people who might elect him. I believe in an America that is officially neither Catholic, Protestant, nor Jewish, where no public official either requests or accepts instructions on public policy from the Pope, the National Council of Churches, or any other ecclesiastical source, where no religious body seeks to impose its will, directly or indirectly, upon the general populace or the public acts of its officials, and where religious liberty is so indivisible that an act against one church is treated as an act against all.
I don't believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute. The idea that the church can have no influence or no involvement in the operation of the state is absolutely antithetical to the objectives and vision of our country. I don't believe in an America where the separation of church and state is...
Hello, my name is Grace Edberg and welcome to the 9th presentation in this series, which is called Church and State. And in this presentation I'll be demonstrating to you why church and state must forever remain separate, and there are severe consequences when the state tries to enforce religious dogmas, and this will become very clear as we continue in this presentation. Now, the question we need to ask ourselves is, why is it so wrong for church and state to join? I mean, we're approaching a time where there's increasing crime happening, bold robberies, rapes, murders. We hear it on the news time and time again. So surely it makes sense to us, to the human mind, that we now enforce the laws of the church, i.e. the Ten Commandments, because the Ten Commandments is about living in harmony with your brethren. So why not make the state enforce the church? It seems like a good idea. Well, we are not to go by what we think, but we are to allow the Bible to explain itself. And you'll find that whenever church and state joins, even in history and even today, deplorable things happen. It is an awful thing, and the best way I can demonstrate this is through looking at the histories where this has taken place. It's always when church and state join that leads to the persecution and the crucifixion of God's true followers, and this will become clear as we continue in the presentation. Now, I'd like to approach this by going to Matthew chapter 22, verse 15 to 21. That's Matthew chapter 22, verse 15 to 21, where we are told, "Then went the Pharisees and took counsel how they might entangle him in his talk." So here you've got the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they're plotting, they want to get Jesus, they want to entangle him in his talk. So they approach him, they sent unto him their disciples with the Herodians, saying, "Master, we know that thou art true, and teachest the way of God in truth. Neither carest thou for any man, for thou regardest not the person of men. Tell us therefore, what thinkest thou? Is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar or not?" But Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, "Why tempt me, ye hypocrites? Show me the tribute money." And they brought unto him a penny. And he said unto them, "Whose is this image and superscription?" They said unto him, "Caesar's." Then said he unto them, "Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." So here we see God is telling us two important duties. We are to render the things that belong to Caesar, and to render what belongs to God unto God. So it seems like an ambiguous answer. What does he mean by this? What does he mean that, what do we owe Caesar and what do we owe God, and how does this differ? Well, I think the best way to approach this is by going to understand what the law is, the Ten Commandments, and show how the Lord has made the specific distinction in terms of what we are to offer to Caesar and what we are to offer to God. And whenever the state tries to enter into God's realm, you find that that's when sudden destruction and persecution happens. Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 13, it speaks of the Ten Commandments, and it tells us, "And he declared unto them his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, even 10 commandments, and he wrote them upon 2 tables of stone." So here we know that God wrote the 10 commandments on 2 tables of stone. Everyone knows that. Now, why is it that he wrote it on 2 tables of stone? He could have easily written it on one. He could have written the 10 commandments on 1 stone. It's not a problem. But he decided to write it on 2. Why? Because he wants to show a separation to us in regards to what we owe to Caesar and what we owe to God. And this becomes clear when we understand the 10 commandments. If you look at the first 4 commandments, as you can see in this table here, you can see that it's all related to God. For example, first commandment, do not worship any other God. Second, do not make any idols. Third, do not misuse the name of God. Fourth, keep the Sabbath. It's all related to my personal relationship with God. It all illustrates to me whether I love God or not. Because in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 to 5, we are told, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is our Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind." So this first table of the law is specifically related to my personal relationship with God. And then we have the second table of the law, and that second table of the law is to do with my personal relationship with my neighbour, with man. For example, commandment number 5, it says, "Honour your father and mother." 6, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not lie, do not covet. This is all to do with how I treat my neighbour. And this can clearly be summarised in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, where we are told, "Thou shalt not avenge, nor bear any grudge against the children of thy people, but thou shalt love thy neighbour as thyself. I am the Lord." Leviticus chapter 9, verse 18. And just to emphasise the fact that the 10 commandments were written in that way, i.e. the first 4 in one table and the last 6 on the second table, is confirmed by a vision Ellen White had in early writings, page 33, where she tells us, "Jesus opened them, and I saw the 10 commandments written on them with the finger of God. On one table were 4, and on the other 6. The 4 on the first table shone brighter than the other 6, but the 4th of the Sabbath commandment shone above them all." So we see it clearly. Ellen White, we know, is a prophet. We established this in our previous presentation, the first presentation called Prophets and Time Prophecy. So if you've got issues with her, please do go back and watch that presentation. Nevertheless, in the vision which she received from God, she clearly showed how the 10 Commandment law was written with the first 4 on the first tablet of the law, and the second tablet, which contained the 6 commandments. God made this specific distinction. We see the first 4 commandments deal with my personal relationship with God, and the last 6 deal with my personal relationship with my neighbour. And it could be summarised as, love God with all your heart and love your neighbour as yourself. And God summarised this in Matthew chapter 22, verse 35 to 14, where he tells us, "Then one of them, which was a lawyer, asked him a question." Again, another one trying to entangle him in his talk. They asked him a question, tempting him and saying, "Master, which is the great commandment of the law?" Jesus said unto them, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbour as thyself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets." Matthew chapter 22, verse 35 to 14. It's interesting, when you talk about the law of God, many people like to say that the 10 commandments is abolished, and they say, it's all about loving God with all your heart, and loving your neighbour. Don't worry about the Sabbath, it's not important. Failing to recognise that these 2 commandments are just a summary of the 10 commandments, Upon those 2 laws, i.e. loving God with all your heart and loving your neighbour, hang all the laws of the prophets, which include the 10 commandments, and God doesn't change. So we see clearly that the 10 commandments still stand, and it amplifies to us what it is to love God with all our heart and what it is to love our neighbour. So the Ten Commandments stand, it's the law of God. And God has made a distinction in terms of what we owe God and what we owe the state. Now, regarding the first 4 commandments, this relates to my personal relationship with God, and it's the role of the state, and it's the role of the church, to teach us in terms of how we worship God. But no way can they say they're going to persecute us if we don't worship how they want us to worship. However, the last 6 commandments is to do with how I treat my neighbour. And the role of the state is to preserve the harmony of society. And it's okay to enforce those last 6 commandments because their role is to make sure we're in harmony, i.e. do not murder, do not kill. They're supposed to look after each and every one of us. But no way can they get involved in the first table of the law, i.e. telling us how we should worship. Because whenever that happens, that's when sudden destruction, persecutions, murder and awful things happen. And the best way I can illustrate this is in the life of Jesus. When we look at the life of Jesus, when we read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, you'll find that the Pharisees, the Sadducees, all of them that were against him, they could never get him on the second table of the law. They never accused him of beating up his parents, for stealing, for committing adultery. They could never get him on any of the last 6 commandments, i.e. Caesar's realm, the state's realm. However, all the accusations which they held against him was to do with his personal relationship with God, was to do with the first table of the law. For instance, if you look at Mark chapter 2 verse 7, Mark chapter 2 verse 7, here they accuse Jesus of blasphemy and they say, "Who doth this man thus speak blasphemies? Why does this man speak blasphemies? For who can forgive sins but God only?" So here they're trying to attack him of, breaking the first commandment, trying to say that he's God, even though he is God. And they'll say, part of that reason why he should be killed is because he said he's God. You find that's one of the reasons. Another accusation that was thrown against him is found in John chapter 10 verse 33, where he says, "The Jews answered him saying, For good work we stone thee not, but for blasphemy, and because that thou being a man maketh thyself God." John 10:33. So you see clear that this relates to the first table of the law and not the second. Again, another example, in John chapter 9 verse 16 we are told, "Therefore said some of the Pharisees, This man is not of God, because he keepeth not the Sabbath day. Others said, How can the man that is a sinner do such miracles? And there was division among them." John 9 verse 16. So here again they accuse him of breaking the Sabbath day. Time and time again he was accused of breaking the Sabbath. So we see clearly that all the accusations which they threw against Jesus, against God, was the fact that they believed that he had broken the first table of the law, and because of this they wanted to kill him. In John chapter 5 verse 16 to 18 we are told, "And therefore did the Jews persecute Jesus, and sought to slay him, because he had done these things on the Sabbath day." Again related to the first table of the law. It continues, "But Jesus answered them, My Father worketh hitherto, and I work." Therefore the Jews sought the more to kill him, because he had not only had he broken the Sabbath, but said also that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. The Bible says, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." This is related to the first table of the law. Again, they wanted to kill him. Why? Because of the first table of the law. Christ didn't get involved in anything to do with the second table of the law, which is Caesar's realm, but it was the first table of the law which they believed he broke, even though we know that wasn't the case. Again, in John chapter 8 verse 58 to 59, Jesus said unto them, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am." Then took they up stones to cast at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. So again, you see the theme that I'm bringing up over and over again. They couldn't get Jesus in regards to how he taught his neighbour, but they could only get him in terms of what they believed, what they ignorantly believed in terms of him transgressing the first table of the law, which is to do with his personal relationship with the Lord. And if the Jews truly studied the Bible, they would have been able to see that it's not up to them to try and enforce religion. It's not their role. Yes, they can show you how to worship, but never should they try and get involved in religion telling you how to worship, because when that happens, it always leads to God's true followers being persecuted, being killed. And that was the result of what took place to Jesus. It's a sad thing to find that Jesus Christ was killed as a result of the church and state united, because that's what took place. In order for them to kill Jesus, they had to unite with Caesar to kill him, to crucifixion. And this is illustrated here in this passage found in John chapter 19, verse 6 to 7, where we are told, "When the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, 'Crucify him, crucify him.' Pilate saith unto them, 'Take ye him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him.'" What did Pilate say? "I find no fault in him." In other words, Jesus hadn't broken the second table of the law. He hadn't entered into Pilate's realm. That's why Pilate says, "I have no fault in him." It continues. Then the Jews answered him, "We have a law, and by our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God." So it's not Pilate's law, it's their own law which they're trying to get Pilate to enforce. So they're saying that yes, he hasn't broken your law, but it's our law he's broken, therefore he needs to be killed. It continues in John chapter 18, verse 30 to 31, we are told, "Pilate then went out unto them and said, What accusations bring ye against this man? They answered and said unto him, If it were not a malefactor, in other words, a wrongdoer, we would not have delivered him unto thee. Then said Pilate unto them, Take ye him, and judge him according to your law. The Jews therefore said unto him, It is not lawful for us to put any man to death. John 18, 30 to 31. So what was the real agenda here? They wanted to kill Jesus, but they couldn't kill Jesus without joining the state. It's a sobering thought, as I mentioned, to find that Jesus was crucified as a result of church and state for supposedly breaking the law of God, even though we know that he didn't. And they're so deceptive that because the church, doesn't have the power to, kill, to murder, what do? They go to the state in order for the state to kill, to enforce their laws. It was no different in the Middle Ages when the Catholic Church joined with the state. They understood that they couldn't kill, they didn't have the right to kill. So what they did, they joined with the state, And today, the Catholic Church might say, oh, we didn't kill anyone, it was the state. But how did the state kill them? As a result of the church speaking to the state to try and enforce them to, persecute or kill God's true followers because they're not doing what they believe that they are doing. And interestingly enough, we know that Christ didn't break any of the laws of Pilate's. 3 times Pilate says to them, I find no fault in him. For instance, in John 18 verse 38 we are told, Pilate said unto him, What is truth? And he had said this, he went out again, and when he had said this, he went out again unto the Jews and said unto them, I find in him no fault at all. John 18:38. Again in John 19:4, Pilate therefore went forth again and said unto them, Behold, I bring him forth to you that ye may know I find no fault in him. Again John 19 verse 6, when the chief priests therefore and officers saw him, they cried out saying, Crucify him, crucify him. Pilate saith unto him, Take ye him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. John 19:6. So clearly, Pilate says it over and over again, he's innocent. But because of the pressure of the Jews and because he wanted to keep his position and stay, he sent an innocent man to death, even though he knew that he didn't do no wrong. And the same thing is going to be repeated in our generation because the Bible clearly tells us this. Jesus, we know, was innocent, but because of the Jewish leaders, because of the religion, because they wanted to, enforce their doctrine, their man-made doctrines, they joined with the state to kill Christ. In John chapter 19 verse 12, here we are told, And from thenceforth Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, If thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend. Whosoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar. So here they try and threaten, Pilate. And, Pilate, knew Jesus was innocent. I mean, even during the crucifixion, if you read the Bible, his wife came to him, she had a vision and she told him to let him go, that he's innocent, had nothing to do with his death. The Holy Spirit was pleading with him, you know the truth, the conscience. But due to self-exaltation, due to him wanting to keep his power, his position, He sent an innocent man to death. Now, can this be repeated again in our time period? Of course it can. Funnily enough, it's always those who claim to be God's people that crucified, the true followers of Christ. You look at it in the Bible, it's always the innocent ones. Jeremiah, Isaiah, the prophets of old, they were killed due to an apostate church that professed to be God's church. In the Bible, in John chapter 16 verse 2, the Lord tells us, they shall put you out of synagogues. Yeah, the time cometh that whosoever killeth you will think that he doeth God's service. Now this is a very strong statement. Those that kill you will actually think that they are doing God's service. Mrs. White, Ellen White says that we have far more to fear from within than without, and it's true. It's always those that claim to be God's people are the ones that killed God's people. For example, if we look at Cain and Abel, we know that Cain was no atheist. He also sent an offering to the Lord. He sent an offering to the Lord. But the problem with Cain is that he wanted to worship how he wanted to worship. He didn't want to worship how God. And because his works were evil, it led to him killing his own brother. You see, the battle is with the two classes, mainly within the church, who wish to worship how they want to worship and not to worship how God wants to worship. So we see clearly how serious and dangerous these things are, especially when church and state unite. In ancient Israel, who was the one that killed the prophets and stoned the prophets of old? Was it Babylon or was it the Philistines? No, it was God's professed people, Israel. The one whom the Bible calls harlot, causing many of the abominations, in Israel, the continuous idolatry and the persecution of the prophets of old. In the times of Christ, we saw those who killed Christ were those who claimed to be his own people. Even Judas was the one that betrayed him. In the Middle Ages, as I mentioned, the Roman Empire, who were the ones that killed the true followers of Christ, who attacked the reformers, who killed them. The reason why the church had to flee to America, to flee in the wilderness, was because of the established church of that day, the Roman Catholic Church. And do you think it's going to be any different in our day and age? You see, today many people are focused on Islam, oil, the Battle of Megiddo, which is going to take place in literal Israel. You see, everyone is focused on the Middle East when we see prophecies fulfilling itself today, with America, Rome, the union taking place. Daniel 11, 40-45, as well as Revelation 13, tells us it's these two powers that are going to come together, unite, and kill the true followers of God under the name of Christianity. You see, we have more to fear from within than without, and the greatest enemies of God's church are those who claim to be his followers. There's nothing new under the sun. History repeats, and that's why it's important we understand these histories and how they were fulfilled, so that when they start to resurface as they are today, i.e. 1989, where we see the papacy now uniting with America, the union taking place, it's now time for us to sound the alarm and warn the people of what's to happen. You see, the greatest emphasis is that church and state must always remain separate, because when they unite, as history has showed us, as the Bible has showed us, great persecution takes place. In Romans chapter 13, verse 1-13, again emphasizing the importance of church and state being separate, Paul himself understood this. And in this chapter, he tells us, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God, the powers that are ordained of God. So everyone be subject to the higher power, the courts and so on. It goes on. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. So in other words, if you go against these powers, these laws which are enforced for our protection, then you yourself will receive damnation. He continues, for rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Will thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is a minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay ye tribute also. In other words, we are to pay our taxes, for they are God's ministers attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom is due, fear to whom fear, honour to whom honour. Owe no man anything but to love one another. For he that loveth one another hath fulfilled the law. For this, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. And if there be any commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, thou shalt love thy neighbour as thyself. Love worketh no ill to his neighbour, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. Now it's highly interesting that the Apostle Paul in this verse now quotes from the second table of the law. Why? Because he's making reference to the fact that what he's talking about in regards to this being subject to the higher powers is in reference to them preserving the harmony of society. Not to do with the first table of the law, but when we are to be subject to them in reference to the fact when they enforce laws, in order to preserve the harmony of society. And that's illustrated in the second table of the law, and that's why he quotes that to make the emphasis. So here Paul is talking about us being subject to the higher powers in reference to them preserving the harmony of society, not for them when they start to try and make laws to enforce religion. It will become very clear as I continue. Nevertheless, the fact that Israel, or spiritual Israel and literal Israel, are to be subject to the laws of the land, again is confirmed in Jeremiah chapter 6 verse 8. Jeremiah chapter 27, I apologise, verse 6 to 8, where he tells us, he is speaking about Nebuchadnezzar, and he tells us, and now I have given all the land into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and the beasts of the fields have I given him also to serve him. In other words, the Lord, he's in control. He appointed the king of the north. At that time was Nebuchadnezzar, and Israel was to be subdued under Nebuchadnezzar. They were to go into Babylon as God commanded. And he says, and all nations shall serve him and his son and his son's son until the very time of his land come. And then many nations and great kings shall serve themselves in him. And it shall come to pass that the nation and the kingdom which will not serve the same Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and that will not put their neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon, that nation will I punish, saith the Lord, with the sword and with the famine and with the pestilence, until I have consumed them by his hand. So the Lord raised up Nebuchadnezzar, a pagan king, and Israel was to be a servant to Nebuchadnezzar. But at what cost? Could Nebuchadnezzar then now try and play the role of God and enforce religion on the people? No, he wouldn't. And when he tried this, what happened? We know God stepped in. In Daniel chapter 3 verse 17 to 18, we know that Nebuchadnezzar set up an image and he told everyone must worship that image. But then you had the 3 Hebrew boys who said, no, hold on. Nebuchadnezzar is now entering into God's realm. He's not entering into the first tablet of the law, i.e. thou shalt not have no other gods before me, thou shalt not worship any images. They understood this, they prepared their minds for this, i.e. in their diet. So when they saw Nebuchadnezzar had done this, they knew that he had infringed in God's table. Therefore they decided they were not going to worship the image. In Deuteronomy chapter 3 verse 17 to 18 we are told, if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Now were they right to state this, even though they were to be servants to Nebuchadnezzar? Yes, they were, and the Lord truly rewarded them, because when they were thrown into the fiery furnace, did they burn? No, one like the Son of Man stood behind them, before them. He protected them. And this is an illustration for us at the end of the world, because in Revelation 13 it speaks about an image being set up, and we'll be commanded to worship that image. But we are to say no to the state, because you've now entered into God's jurisdiction. So there are boundaries in which the state has to follow. It cannot enforce worship, and that's emphasis time and time again in the Bible. Again, another story in the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 6 verse 10 to 13. We know the king at that time now tried to state, that you cannot worship, you cannot pray. And when Daniel ignored this and decided to pray to God, he kneeled down. They wanted to kill him, but again the Lord delivered him. That's illustrated in Daniel chapter 6 verse 10 to 13, where we are told, and when Daniel saw that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber towards Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed, and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. Then they came near and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. Hast thou not signed the decree that every man that shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, save of thee, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, The thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Then answered they and said unto the king, that Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but making his petition 3 times a day. So here they're trying to trap Daniel, they're saying, trying to enforce religion on him, or no, prohibit religion, I should say. In other words, you cannot worship your God. And because of this, they wanted to kill him. But praise God, we know he stood up for him, that when he was thrown to the lions, dead did he die? No, the Lord shut up the mouth of the lion. So we see clearly that there are boundaries which the state must not cross, and they must not enter into God's jurisdiction, i.e. the first table of the law. Nevertheless, all the other laws which they make, i.e. paying tax if they raise up to whatever, we still need to be obedient to this. And you see what took place in America when church and state united and many of them fled to America into the wilderness. They understood the destruction of what happens when church and state unite. So they made the Constitution, and in the first 2 clauses of the Constitution, they emphasised the necessity of church and state being separate. Here in the Constitution it tells, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. In other words, Congress cannot make a law for the benefit of another religious institution, whether it be the Catholic Church or the Adventist Church or whatever. They must not enter into any laws to do with religion. Whereas when we go back to the story of Nebuchadnezzar, we know that he'd broken this law by trying to establish religion by setting up a kingdom, but God said, that's wrong, and that's why he delivered the 3 Hebrew boys. But not only this, we are also told in the Constitution, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. In other words, the law states they cannot prohibit religion. In other words, everyone has the right to worship how they want to worship. And when we look at the story of Daniel in Daniel chapter 6, we know that the king was trying to prohibit religion, but again, God showed us an illustration that they should not do this. See, we see that the Bible, everything's in the Bible, explains everything to us. But it clearly shows us that Congress cannot prohibit religion, neither can it enforce religion. And then it continues to say, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So we see how the Constitution, truly was set up by the hand of God, by the fact that, church and state must remain separate. It's like the barrier, like the law, it's built upon the 10 Commandment law, that church and state must remain separate. And interestingly enough, Ellen White tells us in Great Controversy, page 604, the Constitution of the United States guarantees liberty of conscience. Nothing is more dearer or fundamental. So we see the important role that the Constitution plays in America, and that's why I believe America is so glorious, because it was built upon these precepts in regards to the law of God. And the fact of the matter is, whether you're a Catholic, Adventist, Buddhist or whatever, it's important that we understand that we cannot enforce the state to make a law based upon our faith. It's the role of the church to show us how to worship God, but they cannot enforce religion. Like me being an Adventist, I can share my faith, but I cannot now say if someone rejects it, I'm going to kill you or treat you any differently. It's still my role to love you and allow God to be the judge of that. But it's important to understand that we cannot enforce our religion on anyone. It's freedom of speech. That's God's jurisdiction. However, in regards to the second tablet of the law, i.e. loving your neighbour, it's okay for the state to enforce this law. I mean, the Bible tells us that the time is coming where church and state will unite, whereas just as there was an image set up in the book of Daniel where it was commanded that all should worship the image, so we are told in Revelation that the same thing will happen again. In Revelation chapter 13, beginning at verse 11, we are told, And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. These beasts coming up out of the earth, is America. If you study Revelation 13, it sees a beast come out of the sea, that's the papal church. And then we see this beast coming out of the land, the dry land, it's America. Maybe in previous presentations I'll demonstrate that, but there's so much information on that, without a doubt, that Revelation 13 is talking about this beast that comes out of the earth is America, where in Revelation 12 it talks about them fleeing to the wilderness. The earth opened up, that's America. So we now have another kingdom rising up out of the earth. And he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon, and he exercised all the power of the first beast before him. In other words, he started innocent, meek, which is what it did in America. We said it in the Constitution. Many of the presidents at that time, including Reagan, emphasized that church and state should remain separate. But now it starts to change, the Bible says, and it speaks as a dragon. It says, and he exercised all the power of the first beast before him, and caused the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. In other words, it's going to enforce the whole world to worship the first beast, in other words, the papacy. And he doeth great wonders, so that he make a fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men, and deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth, that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by the sword, and did live. And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak, and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. Revelation 13:11 verse 15. So clearly the Bible tells us that, literal Babylon is just like a lesson book for spiritual Babylon. And we know that Roman church, the king of the north, mystery Babylon the Great, the harlot, she fulfills that role. And we know that America, which is called the false prophet, is going to enforce all. America being the state, it's also in America, and then it goes to the world. It's going to enforce all to try and worship the beast. And we see this union between church and state already beginning to happen. In 1989, I spoke about this many times in previous presentations, i.e. one of the previous presentations, day 11:40 to 45. If you haven't watched that presentation, please do watch that. But here I demonstrate and show how these last verses are for our time period, and I show how it speaks about how the papacy and America unite, church and state united. We go on to overtake certain kingdoms, and then it rules the world and enforced worship and then persecution. And we see how that began in 1989, clearly where we see now America uniting with the papacy. And we are told, one of the earliest goals, as President Reagan says, was to recognize the Vatican as a state and make them an ally. So, even though trying to recognize it as a state, like it's a church, united with them, the Holy Alliance, to overthrow communism. This is the beginning of many woes that are to take place in this earth. And today we see that even within Congress in America, this is taken from a survey in 2007, you find that the majority, were Catholics. And it makes it easier, proves to us that, it makes it easy for them to now begin to want to, push certain laws in preference of their faith, the Catholic Church. I mean, that's going to happen. Clearly, the Bible clearly tells us this. Here we see that, the church truly does fornicate with the kings of the earth. We can see that in these pictures. It unites, goes all to states, many of them recognize it as gods. So we see this union taking place already, and this is dangerous, and we should be aware of these things and warn the people of what is to happen. Again, we know that when the Pope died, John Paul, we see many of the leaders of the state, all in black, coming, to the funeral. It was such a mass, big event. So you see how much high regards they have for the Catholic Church. In the previous presentation, I showed clearly how President Bush said how he saw the Pope as God. So if you're seeing the Pope as God, you see yourself as beneath him, so you're going to want to establish his laws. So we see again church and state uniting clearly. Many times the papacy is always trying to emphasize Sunday worship. Here, this is a publication that was done in September 17, 2007. There's many that have come after this, 2012. But you see how he's saying, give the soul its Sunday, give Sunday his soul, he's chanted before a cloud. And without Sunday worship, we cannot live. So we see that the Pope is now going round, under the guise of peace, claiming for religious freedom, when really what it wants is for everyone to come now and worship on a Sunday. And what's going to happen, the Bible tells us that it's going to go to the state because of the crimes and what's happening, and say, it's because you've turned away from God and that we must enforce the 10 Commandment law, which includes the false Sabbath. And we know that the true Sabbath is the Saturday, and we're going to have to stand up, we who understand and know these things. And when we stand up against the state and say that we're not going to do this, they're going to try and persecute us and kill us. And that's what the Bible is telling us. Again, we see here German Roman Catholics back Pope Sacred Sunday. They're not honouring Sunday, you shouldn't work and so on, making this a state law. We see these things happening. But not only that, it's interestingly enough is that we see many other religions coming to the Pope. In the Guardian, it states, the future of the world depends on peace between Muslims and Christianity, Islamic scholars told Pope today. 138 prominent Muslim scholars said that finding common ground, this is ecumenism, between the world's biggest two religions was not simply a matter of political, ecumenical dialogue. And in the United Press, October 13th, it says, to reach such a lofty goal, the letter compares certain Bible verses with similar passages in the Quran in an attempt to show the similarities between the two religions. So we see these things are just signs for us to be aware that they're all coming together, under ecumenism. The Pope is head. In other presentations I show that all of these major religions do bow down to the Pope and see him as sovereign. Again, these are things that should really awaken our minds to understand what is happening, and that, it's only a matter of time before these things happen. And if we don't know what we believe, or we can't show the people the errors of their way, then it's going to lead to many, even ourselves, lost, because we've been told that criticism is going to come upon every doctrine that we hold, including why church and state must remain separate. And that's why I'm doing this presentation, and why I believe it's important that we understand this. Even in 2005, there was a 10 Commandment Commission that was organised. And it was organised for the main purpose behind to create a global think tank with the world leaders who have already recognised the power behind the 10 Commandments. We are a grassroots movement joined by some of the nation's largest ministries. So we see professed Protestant nations, really and truly they're apostate Protestants, because to be a true Protestant is to oppose Rome and its false doctrines. But here we see apostate Protestantism now uniting, coming together, trying to enforce the state to what? To keep the 10 Commandments. And we see that there are many leaders, many religious movements that are all edging this, trying to get the 10 Commandments binding, which will include the false Sabbath, and trying to get the state to enforce it. And when the state enforces these laws, it will be a consequence of also preventing us as Seventh-day Adventists keeping the true Sabbath of the Lord. And these things are happening, and prophecy has told us this. That's why it's important that we understand Daniel 40-45, the book of Revelation. It's written for our time, so we can study the prophecies and tell the people that this is not God's will. Church and state should not unite. It's what killed Christ was a result of church and state. What took place in the Middle Ages was a result of church and state. And if we're going to do the same thing today in America, then what's going to happen is that the same thing's going to happen, persecution and sudden destruction. And that's why it's important that we understand these things so we can warn the world of what's going to happen. We are told by Ellen White in Last Day Events, page 209, paragraph 1, she says, "It does not seem possible to us now that any should have to stand alone. But if God has ever spoken by me, the time will come when we shall be brought before councils and before thousands for his name's sake, and each one will have to give the reason for his faith. There will come the severest criticism upon every position that has been taken for the truth. We need then to study the word of God that we may know why we believe the doctrines we advocate." So again, she's saying that the severest criticisms, intelligent minds will be, trying to examine the Seventh-day Adventist doctrine that's going on now and trying to understand, what is this about the Sabbath? What is this about the church and state? Many of us are going to be brought to courts to give a reason for our faith. And if we can't understand, or if we don't know why church and state should remain separate, or about the Sabbath, the mark of the beast, then what's going to happen? We're going to fall, clearly. She tells us, many will have to stand in legislative courts Someone had to stand before kings and before the learned of the earth to answer for their faith. Those who have only a superficial understanding of the truth will not be able to clearly expound the scriptures and give definite reasons for their faith. They will become confused and will not be aware of it, that need not to be ashamed. Let no one imagine that he has no need to study because he is not to preach at the sacred desk. You know not what God may require of you. Last Day Events, page 209, paragraph 2. So here we see a solemn statement from the prophet of the Lord, counseling and telling each and every one of us to study, to show ourselves approved. The reason why I felt a burden to do this presentation, Church and State, is because I believe many people fail to understand why Church and State should remain separate. And I believe with what's happening now in terms of the increasing crimes, the robberies, the thunderstorms, what's going to happen, Ellen White tells us, is that many will be saying, it's because we've gone away from God, that's why all these things are happening. In order to restore morality in this world, we must make the Ten Commandments binding. It's going to sound so convincing as well, because when you see this happening, as a Christian, you think, oh no, we've turned away from God, so we must, bring back the Ten Commandments law, including the first tablet, and make sure everyone keeps, and that would, present, peace. But that's not the case, She tells us national apostasy will be a result of national ruin, and national apostasy will be the fact that they will try and enforce a day of worship which has no sanctity, that being the Sabbath day. And I thank you for your time for watching this presentation. If you've got any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. And I pray you take these things seriously and go over what I've studied. And as I've mentioned before, make the Further Angels message your own, and also try and understand. Sometimes we say things, we preach about things, but we're not really able to back up what we say. And it's important that we're able to make our stand, whether it's on the Sabbath, Church and State, based upon Scripture. So please do go back and study it. And thank you for your time once again.